The campus looked ordinary in the early morning light. Lecture halls were still dark, parking lots mostly empty, and security cameras traced their usual slow arcs across sidewalks that saw thousands of students every day. Nothing about the scene suggested federal attention, let alone a coordinated operation involving dozens of agents. That changed just after dawn. Unmarked vehicles rolled in quietly, positioning themselves at key access points around the property. Agents moved out in controlled lines, radios low, eyes fixed on entrances they had studied for weeks. Within minutes, the campus was no longer an open space. It was a contained perimeter. The arrest that followed was precise. Federal officials confirmed that the operation targeted a key suspect connected to a drug distribution network operating in and around Minneapolis. The individual taken into custody was identified as a close relative of a figure already known to investigators, someone whose name had surfaced repeatedly during an ongoing inquiry into narcotics trafficking and financial coordination. According to authorities, this was not a sudden decision. The raid was the result of months of surveillance, data analysis, and quiet coordination between federal agencies. Investigators believed the suspect played a central role in facilitating movement, access, and protection for a network that had managed to operate without drawing attention in a public setting. What drew particular concern was the location. Campuses are designed for openness, multiple entry points, constant foot traffic, a steady flow of vehicles and visitors. That openness, investigators warned, can also create blind spots. In this case, they believed those blind spots had been exploited deliberately. The investigation began far from any classroom. Agents working a broader drug trafficking case had flagged communications tied to a Minneapolis-based operation. At first, the activity appeared routine. Short exchanges, vague references, no obvious indicators of scale. But when analysts overlaid location data, a pattern emerged. Several contacts repeatedly converged near the same campus facilities, often during off hours. That coincidence raised questions. Further review showed that certain vehicles associated with known distribution routes were entering and leaving campus parking structures without explanation. License plate data revealed repeat visits timed closely to known shipment windows elsewhere in the city. What initially looked like incidental traffic began to resemble coordination. Federal teams expanded surveillance cautiously. They documented movements over weeks, tracking arrival times, durations, and interactions. Meetings were brief. No prolonged conversations. No visible exchanges. But consistency told its own story. The same individuals appeared again and again. The same locations were used repeatedly. The same timing patterns held. Financial analysts added another layer. Accounts connected to individuals linked with the campus activity showed deposits that did not match employment records or academic affiliations. Payments moved through intermediaries before settling in accounts tied to small businesses with no clear operational footprint. Each transaction alone appeared harmless. Together, they formed a flow that demanded attention. As the picture sharpened, investigators identified a single figure acting as a point of convergence. Communications flowed through this individual. Movements aligned around their schedule. Transfers followed shortly after key meetings. Agents concluded they were looking at a coordinator rather than a courier. That assessment elevated the case. By the time warrants were drafted, federal agencies had linked the suspect to a wider network believed to be responsible for distributing significant quantities of narcotics across the region. In the hours after the arrest, investigators moved quickly to secure what they believed was the most fragile part of the case: the digital trail. Devices seized during the campus operation were isolated immediately, shielded from remote access, and transferred to forensic teams trained to extract data without altering its structure. What they found confirmed their suspicions. Messages recovered from encrypted applications showed a pattern of coordination that went well beyond casual association. Short instructions were sent at precise times. Locations were referenced indirectly. Amounts were never stated outright, but context made their meaning clear. Analysts compared the timestamps against known enforcement actions across Minneapolis and found consistent alignment. When pressure increased elsewhere in the city, activity on campus increased. Investigators began reconstructing timelines. On days when narcotic seizures occurred miles away, campus-related communications spiked. Vehicles linked to the suspect appeared shortly afterward in parking facilities, remaining just long enough to suggest handoffs rather than storage. The campus functioned as a buffer, absorbing movement without drawing attention. Financial data reinforced that conclusion. Accounts tied to the suspect showed a steady pattern of deposits following these periods of activity. The funds rarely remained in one place for long. They were transferred through layered accounts, often moving within hours. Some payments were routed through tuition-related services or housing intermediaries, providing a legitimate explanation on paper while obscuring their source. Investigators described the setup as deliberate. By operating within a public institution, the network benefited from assumptions of normalcy. Security was designed to protect students, not detect criminal coordination. Traffic was constant. Visitors were expected. The environment allowed brief interactions to disappear into routine. As federal teams expanded their review, they identified additional individuals connected to the campus activity. None appeared to be students in the traditional sense. Some held temporary positions. Others were listed as contractors or affiliates of outside organizations with limited oversight. Each one played a narrow role, limiting exposure if any single person were questioned. The structure mirrored known trafficking models. Rather than concentrating responsibility, the network distributed it. No one individual handled logistics, finance, and communication simultaneously. Couriers did not manage accounts. Coordinators did not touch product directly. This separation reduced risk and slowed investigations, requiring agencies to assemble the case piece by piece. Agents also noted how quickly the network adjusted. Within 24 hours of the arrest, communications shifted tone. Instructions became shorter. Meetings were postponed or canceled outright. Several devices went silent. Vehicles previously observed near campus stopped appearing. Analysts interpreted the change as damage control. That reaction suggested awareness. Investigators believed the suspect's role extended beyond coordination. They may have served as a signal point, confirming when it was safe to move or when to pause. Removing that node disrupted timing across the network, creating uncertainty among participants who relied on predictability. As attention remained focused on the campus, teams began working outward. Data from seized devices referenced other locations using coded language. Warehouses described as offices. Storage units labeled as archives. Addresses were cross-checked against lease records, revealing connections to shell entities already under review in separate investigations. Federal agents executed additional warrants quietly, avoiding publicity while securing evidence before it could be destroyed. In one location, they recovered packaging materials identical to those used in recent drug seizures. In another, they found ledgers tracking quantities and movement schedules, written in shorthand understood only by those inside the operation. The scope continued to expand. Drug enforcement units provided updated estimates based on combined seizure data and recovered records. Analysts now believed the network was responsible for moving quantities large enough to affect regional supply levels. This was not a localized operation serving a single city. It was part of a corridor. Investigators also examined how the network maintained discipline. Communications discouraged unnecessary contact. Meetings were limited in duration. Locations were rotated. Payments were structured to reward compliance and silence. Those patterns, agents noted, were as the investigation pushed beyond the campus, federal teams began concentrating on the physical infrastructure that supported the network. Digital records and financial trails had established coordination, but the next question was how such a system sustained large-scale movement without detection. The answer emerged through logistics. Agents reconstructed travel patterns using toll records, license plate readers, and commercial leasing databases. Vehicles associated with the network followed consistent routes across Minneapolis and into surrounding counties. Movements were timed carefully, often during low-traffic hours. Stops were brief. Locations were reused only when activity blended seamlessly with normal operations. Several of those locations stood out. Warehouses, office parks, and light industrial buildings appeared repeatedly in surveillance logs. None showed signs of conventional business activity. Utilities were minimal. Staffing records were thin or non-existent. Yet vehicles arrived with regularity, remaining long enough to suggest loading or coordination rather than storage. Search warrants were prepared quietly. When agents entered the first site, they found little at a glance. Empty floors, shelving units, packaging materials stacked neatly against walls. But behind false panels and secured rooms, they uncovered sealed containers matching those recovered in earlier seizures. Field testing confirmed the presence of synthetic narcotics at high concentrations. Similar discoveries followed. At a second location, investigators found chemical precursors and pill presses, indicating that at least part of the operation involved on-site processing. The setup was efficient. designed to produce counterfeit pills that closely resembled legitimate prescriptions. Analysts noted the level of quality control. This was not an improvised lab. It was a controlled environment. As the scope became clearer, federal agencies coordinated with regional task forces. Seizure data from neighboring states was reviewed again, this time with the expanded network in mind. Patterns aligned quickly. Packaging styles matched. Batch markings were consistent. Routes overlapped with those identified in the Minneapolis investigation. Analysts now believed the network extended well beyond city limits, functioning as part of a broader distribution corridor. Updated estimates reflected that expansion. Based on confirmed seizures, recovered records, and intercepted shipments, investigators linked the operation to multi-ton quantities of narcotics moved over an extended period. The scale placed it among the larger regional networks under active review. More concerning was the efficiency. Losses were minimal. Disruptions were rare until recent enforcement actions. Investigators also examined how the network managed risk. Communications recovered from seized devices showed strict internal rules. Couriers were instructed to avoid deviations. Routes were changed only when necessary. Contacts were limited to specific windows. Violations were discouraged through financial penalties rather than threats, reinforcing discipline without drawing attention. The role of coordination became central again. Agents believed the suspect arrested on campus acted as a stabilizing node. Not the leader, but a facilitator who ensured timing remained predictable. With that node removed, the network began showing signs of strain. Intercepted messages reflected uncertainty. Questions replaced instructions. Delays appeared where schedules had once been precise. Those disruptions led to mistakes. In one instance, a vehicle associated with the network arrived at a warehouse outside its usual window. Surveillance teams noted the deviation and followed. The vehicle led agents to a secondary storage site previously unknown to investigators. A warrant executed there yielded additional packaging materials, cash reserves, and handwritten notes outlining shipment schedules. The notes provided critical context. They showed how logistics were aligned with external factors. Court dates, enforcement cycles, financial clearing periods. The network did not operate blindly. It adjusted based on perceived pressure, reducing activity during periods of heightened scrutiny and expanding when conditions appeared favorable. Federal analysts cross-referenced those notes with court calendars and enforcement data. The alignment was striking. On weeks when enforcement actions were delayed or reduced, shipments increased. With logistics disrupted and multiple locations secured, investigators shifted their focus to understanding how the network had protected itself for so long. The question was no longer how drugs moved, but how scrutiny had been delayed at nearly every stage. Financial records provided the first answer. Analysts reconstructed transactions tied to individuals connected with the campus operation, layering bank data, payment processors, and shell entities. What emerged was a system designed to appear ordinary. Transfers were broken into predictable amounts. Timing followed familiar business cycles. Labels used common categories like consulting fees, maintenance services, or temporary staffing costs. Nothing stood out on its own. Only when investigators viewed the data as a whole did the design become clear. Money flowed in steady patterns, routed through entities that provided just enough legitimacy to avoid deeper review. When questions arose, documentation appeared quickly, often formatted professionally and submitted without delay. Oversight mechanisms were not bypassed. They were exhausted. As the financial picture sharpened, federal teams began interviewing individuals who had unknowingly supported the operation. Property managers who processed leases. Vendors who accepted payments for services that were never fully delivered. Administrators who filed paperwork they did not understand but were told was routine. Most described the same experience. They were given instructions that sounded reasonable. Requests arrived with confidence and urgency. Credentials were presented. References were implied. The assumption of legitimacy did the rest. Few felt empowered to question transactions that appeared properly documented and professionally handled. Investigators recognized the pattern immediately. The network relied on credibility as much as concealment. It did not hide behind threats or secrecy. It hid behind routine. Familiar processes. Trusted systems. That reliance allowed it to scale without triggering alarms designed to detect obvious abuse. Narcotics analysts added another layer. By comparing shipment timelines with enforcement actions, they identified periods when pressure eased unexpectedly. During those windows, activity increased sharply. Shipments moved more frequently. Storage sites were rotated less often. Risk tolerance rose. Investigators concluded the network believed it could predict enforcement behavior with reasonable accuracy. That belief proved costly. As pressure mounted following the campus arrest, those predictions failed. Enforcement actions became less predictable. Warrants were executed without public notice. Financial holds were placed suddenly. Communications that once guided timing were no longer reliable. The network responded unevenly. Some participants attempted to continue operations, relying on old routines. Others pulled back completely, cutting contact and abandoning assets. The inconsistency created gaps that investigators exploited. Surveillance teams followed new movements. Analysts tracked hurried transfers. Each reaction revealed more about internal structure. Federal prosecutors reviewed the expanding evidence with caution. They emphasized the need to separate proximity from responsibility. Not everyone connected to the network was equally involved. Some roles were peripheral. Others were central. Building a credible case required distinguishing between those who enabled the system knowingly and those who were used by it. That distinction guided the next phase. Subpoenas were issued selectively. Immunity agreements were considered. In some cases, individuals cooperated quickly, providing insight into how instructions were delivered and why they were followed without question. Their accounts reinforced what the documents already suggested. The network did not rely on fear. It relied on trust. As testimony accumulated, the broader implications became unavoidable. Institutions designed to protect public interest had been leveraged indirectly. Not through overt corruption alone but through assumptions. Assumptions that paperwork was honest. That credentials were valid. That routine meant safe. Each assumption reduced friction. Reduced friction allowed movement. Internally, federal agencies began reassessing how such assumptions formed. Oversight protocols were reviewed. Thresholds for review were reconsidered. Data sharing between financial regulators and enforcement agencies was expanded. The goal was not to assign blame retroactively, but to identify where blind spots had formed. The human impact remained central. Investigators compiled reports linking distribution periods to spikes in overdoses. Emergency responders described patterns that now aligned with shipment windows. Communities affected by addiction experienced cycles of harm that mirrored the network's activity almost exactly. Those correlations strengthened the case. They demonstrated that the operation's effects were not theoretical. They were measurable. Each decision to move product, each choice to exploit a system, translated into real-world consequences that extended far beyond the network itself. As the investigation entered its final stage, prosecutors faced a familiar challenge. The evidence was extensive but complex. Explaining how ordinary systems were repurposed required clarity without oversimplification. The case was no longer just. As the investigation moved toward its conclusion, federal officials focused less on expanding the case and more on defining what it represented. By this stage, the arrests, seizures, and searches had established the existence of a coordinated network. What remained was the broader question of impact and accountability. Prosecutors framed the case carefully. They emphasized that the operation was not built on secrecy alone. It was built on predictability. Systems functioned as expected. Processes followed routine paths. Oversight relied on assumptions that, over time, became vulnerabilities. The network did not need to bypass safeguards aggressively. It learned how to move within them. That distinction shaped the final assessments. Investigators noted that no single failure allowed the operation to grow. Instead, small gaps aligned. Financial reviews focused on volume rather than patterns. Enforcement cycles followed familiar rhythms. Public institutions trusted credentials presented with confidence. Individually, each choice made sense. Together, they created space for exploitation. Federal agencies began formal reviews of their own procedures. Data sharing protocols were expanded to ensure financial anomalies tied to enforcement actions triggered cross-agency alerts. Review thresholds were adjusted. Automated systems were paired with human oversight in cases involving repeated low-level irregularities. The aim was not to eliminate trust, but to balance it with verification. For the network's remaining participants, the consequences were immediate. With assets frozen and routes compromised, operations stalled. Couriers stopped receiving instructions. Storage sites went unused. Communications fractured as participants questioned who remained exposed. Investigators monitored the collapse quietly, intervening only when necessary to preserve evidence or prevent harm. The public response unfolded more slowly. Officials avoided sweeping statements or broad accusations. Community leaders were briefed privately. Emphasis was placed on separating criminal responsibility from identity or affiliation. Outreach focused on prevention, education, and rebuilding confidence where it had been shaken. Behind the scenes, prosecutors prepared cases designed to withstand scrutiny. Charges were constructed around documented actions rather than inference. Financial records were paired with timelines. Communications were contextualized carefully. Each claim was supported by multiple sources. The objective was durability, not speed. As the final reports were compiled, one conclusion appeared repeatedly across agencies. The most damaging element of the operation was not its scale, but its normalization. The ability to function without raising suspicion depended on familiarity. Familiar places, familiar processes, familiar expectations. Once those expectations went unchallenged, the network thrived. The arrests marked the end of one chapter, not the end of the risk. Federal officials warned that similar structures could emerge wherever systems rely too heavily on routine without review. The lesson was not limited to this case or this city. It applied broadly to any environment where credibility goes unquestioned and oversight becomes procedural. In closing assessments, investigators avoided dramatic language. They described the outcome plainly. A network was disrupted. Harm was reduced. Gaps were identified. Corrections were underway. The work, they noted, was ongoing. What happened on that campus and beyond did not expose a single failure. It exposed a pattern. And whether that pattern would repeat depended not on enforcement alone, but on whether institutions chose to examine the assumptions that allowed it to exist in the first place. That choice, officials concluded, would determine whether this case remained an exception, or became a warning.